Thank you everybody for coming here. I promised you last time a lecture on Elon Musk, and I'm afraid Elon Musk is going to have to wait. Um, Elon Musk will still be with us next week. So will racism, of course. In fact, one could try to figure out which is going to be faster, solving institutional racism or getting Elon Musk people to Mars. I suspect Mars will happen first. But in any case, Elon Musk will be next week unless something else horrible happens or potential for change happens. So we already have a preview then of what's going to be coming. All right, now before I get started, I want to explain, and I don't think it'll be a surprise, that a lot of these Russian memes are going to have to do with the question of looting. And by the way, looting has become just an interesting terminological thing in Russian right now because the word that is usually used, marодерство, is now there's a suggestion of importing the word looting, which I find kind of odd in that it seems to suggest somehow looting is nicer than the word marодерство would actually mean basically the same thing, to the distinction about peacetime. But anyway, the focus of these memes is unsurprisingly very much about looting, just as so much of the focus in the right-wing focus in the United States on Black Lives Matter pays more attention to looting than to the actual status of over-policing Black people and of police violence. So before I show those memes, I just want to show an American meme that gives my feeling about it, just to make very clear that in showing all of these memes about looting, I'm trying to convey a set of opinions that we're going to be seeing a lot on the Russian internet. Okay, so some background here on race in Russia and where it fits into scholarship. My own awareness of the question of race in Russian scholarship and race in Russian literature has been with me since I started studying the material, but it would catch me at surprise at moments when I wasn't even thinking about it. I remember when I was working on my dissertation and I was reading everything I could by Yuri Alesha, and so I was reading his fabulous children's сказка, short novel, Три толстяка, The Three Fat Men. And I'm reading it and I'm thinking, this is such a wonderful novel. I don't know why it hasn't taken off in English. Why aren't children all around America and the UK reading it? Until I got to a point where the main hero, who is an acrobat, in order to disguise himself from the villains, the Three Fat Men, goes to a scientist who gives an elixir and turns him into a black man. And every time anyone sees him, they run away screaming in horror. And at that moment I thought, oh, okay, now I see why this book will never play very well in translation. And moments like that come up again and again and again. So how does this, the subject of this talk here play out as scholarship? As always, this is not a footnoted lecture. My research is very much in the background based on scholarly and public work and social media comments and conversations by a number of scholars. And I completely agree that we need to know the field and cite the existing work. The topic of racism is something that I've been doing the work of reading about for many years now. But what I have not done for today's lecture is the work of rereading the scholarship on race and Russia. This was a spontaneous lecture topic, as you can know from the fact that it wasn't what I was going to do for this week in the first place. And so I'm relying on my memory of all of this work in a way that I wouldn't if I were writing for publication. Now, I hate when it comes to actual work that I'm publishing, I always hate listing people for acknowledgements because I know I'm always going to leave someone out. But in this case, I do think it's worth just reminding people, at least of the names of people who have produced either interesting scholarship or contributions on social media or public intellectual work on topics related to race in Russia. So here is names of the people whom I remembered when I was making up this list, all of whom, to the extent that they have written about this, I highly recommend reading their work, and all of whom have contributed to what I want to say, but in ways that I frankly don't remember because I have not done that particular type of rereading. Okay, so when we talked last week about Greta Thunberg and the gap that many of us in the States feel when we're seeing posts by our friends in Russia about her, we're talking about the gap between, say, my people here and my people over there. That gap is nothing compared to the gap on race, particularly the gap when it comes to talking about people of African descent. Although I think there is a big overlap and there's some common roots. So what is going on with racism, particularly with anti-Black racism in Russia and on the Russian internet? there's been lots of discussion about the category of race in Russia when it comes to scholarship, and recognition that the category of race doesn't map on, that the American category of race doesn't map on so precisely to the way that difference is parsed in the former Soviet Union and Russia. As those of you who perhaps have seen ads in online ads or ads in newspaper know, that when people want to discriminate against what we would call people of color, say when they're subletting apartments, they would say they want people of Slavic or European descent, rather than saying white people. That's simply the way that this is conveyed. And within Russia, the biggest target of racism, the biggest victims of racism, of course, the people who have been present in the Russian Federation and Soviet Union in large numbers for a long time, and that's Asians and people from the Caucasus. The number of people who would be considered Black by American standards, and America has this one drop rule and all of that, the number of people who would be considered Black in the Russian Federation is tiny. The population is there, but it's very, very small. So then one wonders, why is there so much expression of anti-Black racism? What is it related to? It can't be related to personal experience. In addition, the Soviet Union was explicitly anti-racist in its policy and its propaganda, in its work with post-colonial Africa, in its exploitation of US racism for propaganda purposes. You would think then that this would not lead to the sort of racist expression we're seeing today. How did we get here? So these again are my own provisional thoughts based on years of reading and interacting. They're not publishable in the sense that they're not supported enough. But again, this is an informal lecture. So I just want to talk about the racism first before we actually see some of these memes. So one source, I think, is a kind of Marxist epistemological hegemony. Because it has to do with Soviet Marxist ideas about the priorities of different struggles. Think of what happened to feminism when the Soviet Union actually came into existence after the revolution. This is an example that I think is more familiar to many of us than the question of racial difference in the former Soviet Union. The idea was, yes, women are oppressed, but that will be taken care of after the revolution. This was the very common Marxist revolutionary attitude towards feminism. Feminist activism was secondary and even regressive if it was not part of a Marxist revolutionary platform. Feminist policies would theoretically be enacted after the revolution. And in fact, many of them were. But did that end sexism in the Soviet Union? Obviously not. There were a couple problems. First, there was the assumption that women's oppression was solely the result of capitalism, and without capitalism, there would be no problem. There was an inability to see gender as an independent category. And of course, there were the inadequate social programs to make up for the changes in the family. And third, I think this is most important and also maps on very well to discussions of what happens with ideologies of race and racism, is that any feminist gains in the Soviet Union were not the result of grassroots, multifaceted public conversation. There was not an ongoing organic discourse, but a problem solved. So there's consciousness raising, but with a great deal of limits. I think the same thing was going on with race. There was not a widespread discussion. There was not large-scale participation in thinking about these matters. They were simply decided and proclaimed. Questions of race, ethnicity, and national difference were seen as largely secondary to questions of class. Now, there's lots of discussion in the US right now about racism and capitalism for good reason. In particular, the sense that it is capitalism in America that facilitates racism and that American capitalism is built on racism. I have no problem with that. Capitalism may well be the best habitat for racism, but it's not the only habitat. In the Soviet Union, with the development of various nationality policies, Kardinization, language policies, and so on and so forth. Again, there were policies being made to try, at least on this, in some realms, to remedy inequities among people of various ethnic or national backgrounds, but they were not part of public participatory discourse. They were decisions that were being made. And the hierarchy of different ethnicities, the idea that Russians could have little brother ethnicities, for instance, was left largely unexamined. So official policy was anti-racist, but where was the space to talk about, for example, the hostility to African students who started to come to the Soviet Union in the 50s and later, or anxiety about Black women and our Russian girls? There was really no room to address that, to talk that through. So all of the more familiar, explicit racist ideas were there, but kind of but not reflected very well in public discourse, and therefore not examined and not challenged.
Hey, Eliot, we're just
Yeah?
seeing a blank white screen. I don't know. Oh, there we go.
Yeah, I don't know why the first one disappeared. The second issue is the weakness of the social sciences. The social sciences in the Soviet Union were underdeveloped for a lot of reasons, obviously having to do with ideology, among other things, which left lots of room for pseudoscience. Interestingly enough, class-based social science easily got biologized. We see that early on with the whole notion of the hereditary proletarian, but later with the works of Lev Gumilyov, and then the sort of enshrinement of his ideas after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Lev Gumilyov's idea of ethnogenesis, which treats nations and ethnicities as almost biological organisms that have laws of evolution unto themselves. There's all sorts of discourse in post-Soviet Russia about the gene pool, as if there's this very specific national treasure Russian gene pool that must be maintained and is under threat. Also, after communism, there was knee-jerk reactions against the pieties of the USSR. There were all the ethnic conflicts, the importation of Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilization narrative with its very implicit racism that got much more explicit in Huntington's later work, and a retreat from anything that resembles social construction. That is an emphasis on essentialism, primordialism, the natural. The natural what was distorted supposedly by the Soviet regime, and therefore we should not be spending so much time thinking about the social construction of things. We should be thinking about how things really are. We also have the rise of the right wing. The collapse of communism gave room for an obvious appeal of the right wing as a kind of opposite tendency. It was always there, and now there's a big resurgence. And in part thanks to the links with the Western right wing that started in part with abortion politics when American right-wing evangelicals started to come to Russia in the 1990s, in fact, bringing Silent Scream and other propaganda with them. From there, you get the evangelicals bringing anti-LGBT politics. You get the strange marriage of post-Soviet Russia and the conspiracy theories of Lyndon LaRouche, and you get anti-globalism, all of which reinforces tendencies to think in terms of one's own and sort of circling the wagons. Also, even back in the 1990s, there was plenty of conversation about how America is on the verge of collapsing thanks to a coming race war. I remember this in some pseudo-documentaries by Alexander Gordon in the 1990s. And interestingly enough, in some ways, they're predicting the racial conflict that we see, but the framework of it is really more like, say, the Turner Diaries, the Bible of the Russian right wing, because the assumption is, in fact, there's a race war. Whites are going to lose, but they shouldn't lose because they're superior. They're seeing something but misdiagnosing it, more like the way that Black people are talked about in Brother 2, if you're familiar with the movie. And also, Russian discourse imports a caricature of political correctness, which then makes any discussion of social justice difficult. There's also the problem of difference. Russia is not alone in having traditions of distrusting difference. Most cultures do, but nationalists or conservatives or statist media and ideologies are invested in the vision of Russia that's essentialist and unchanging. That means that all conversations that are happening elsewhere are alien and should not be happening in Russia. In an alternate reality, the media could be, say, encouraging people to think about what it means to be different, to respect difference, like Lyudmila Ulitskaya was doing in her series of books in the first decade of the 21st century. But instead, you have a very concerted effort to make the whole idea of tolerance seem like an enemy. In America, until recently, at least, Americans were largely ashamed of their own racism. It's something to be to not advertise. Trump has been changing that. We know it's something that at the very least we should be embarrassed about, but a common Russian reaction is to see this as hypocrisy. There's the legacy of colonialism and empire, a projection of majority empire status that ethnic Russians see themselves having in Russia, projected onto the status of white people in the United States. This plays out at immigration. The colonialist attitude of Russian speakers towards the non-Russian population in the USSR easily translates to, say, people of color in the US or to Muslims and Arabs in Israel. The natives, in quotes, are always constructed as backwards. And also, Putinist culture is very much not in the mood to look at crimes of the past and apologize for them. That was happening in the 1990s. Now we proclaim greatness, and we just do not pay attention to the terrible disasters and crimes. And to do so would be weak. And I think that when America is seen as engaging in navel gazing or apologizing for its past crimes, America is being weak. There's also, very importantly, a problem of competitive victimhood and the notion of what I call the beset majority. This is Russian insecurity about its own majority status, a feeling that there's a zero-sum game between the rights of the majority and the rights of minorities. That democracy or majority rule means that you don't actually have to take minority views into account so much. There's not a tradition of demanding minority representation, of wanting the media to look like us, whoever us is. If when it comes to anti-Semitism, as displayed by the mathematician and dissident Shafarievich with his book Russophobia, anti-Semitism in Russia seems to have a bit of a chosen people envy. That is, Russians the idea is Russians are the chosen people, not Jews. Here, there's a kind of competitive oppression. Who are you to say you've suffered when we have suffered so much? And this is at the heart, I think, of the distinction between these two worlds of discussion of difference that we're seeing online right now. American liberal traditions are to see oppression as broad, fungible, shared, and the basis of coalition building. The recognition of oppression should allow us to build a template from which you can use to understand the oppression of another group. Not so much in Russia. You see more the attitude that we suffered. How can you complain about suffering? The suffering of Russians at various points could be the basis of a radical empathy. But instead, it often turns inwards, gets protective, gets competitive, and gets hostile. So with Black people, yes, they supported liberation, but there was also a long-standing need to situate Soviets or Russians as better than a particular indexical oppressed group. Many of us are familiar with the common Russian expression, like after you're standing around for a while and finally get to sit down on a seat on a subway, people might say, наконец, как белые люди, we get to sit like white people, which makes Americans cringe, I think, for good reason. Russians don't want to be like Blacks, but there is the fear, I think, that they very much are in a position that is like whatever position they're imagining Black people in, and they do not want to be treated like that. There's an opposition that is, I think, kind of like what goes on with poor Southern whites. There's a sense of Russians as eternal victims, lots of oppression. Okay. And then there's also a strange competition with Black culture. Remember the Gopnik, when we talked about the Gopnik, this the sort of street thug who's always squatting, right? There is a lot of overlap between Gopnik culture and hip hop culture. There's the caricature of Russians as gangsters that maps on fairly well to some caricatures, some Black caricatures from hip hop. I think of a very popular YouTube video in America where the comedian Dan Soder has this routine where he talks about quote, Russians being the scariest white people, which has a lot to unpack there, of course, the notion being that whoever's the scariest white people, there are people scarier than that and they're not white. There's the longstanding Russian appropriation of rap and hip hop, a desire to be like Black people, but also to fear and hate them. This should, I think, be familiar. And there's a culture of trolling. How dare you tell me what I can and cannot say, what is considered impolite or racist? That is censorship. Freedom is about the ability to say anything outrageous and to offend, which is pretty ironic, given that the laws and law enforcement of Putin and Russia are such that the last thing you want to do is test the limits of a given prohibition. So all of this brings us to the hashtag that many of you heard about, I think in the past couple of weeks, of Russian Lives Matter, a hashtag in English. Russian Lives Matter is once again about comparison, about relative victimhood, who is a worthy victim, and so on and so forth, but it's also quite deliberate trolling. The libertarian Mikhail Svetov on June 1st came up with this hashtag after the horrible, senseless police killing of a man in Yekaterinburg. But the fact that the hashtag is in English brings up some important questions. What is it in Russian? Is it Ruskiye lives that matter, or is it Rossiyskiye lives? Is it ethnic Russian lives, or is it everybody in Russia? Svetov insists on using Ruskiye, the ethnic term, but claiming that it's for everybody. But really what he's doing is giving a huge dog whistle, that it's very much about the status of that Russians as an ethnic group are somehow suffering and oppressed in Russia. And the responses about the responses in support of Russian Lives Matter very much come back to this notion of comparison to Black people in the United States. A woman who used the hashtag wrote, "Everyone's gone nuts with hatred for the cops in the States, but they've managed to close their eyes to the fact that Russian National Guardmen right here at home can't really explain the murder of a person for stealing 4 rolls of wallpaper in his own home. So, why are we talking about what's going on in the States?" Sviatov himself says, "How did it come to be that it's safer for Blacks in the USA than Ruskие in Russia?" Charitably, this could be a failed attempt at coalition building, like Pussy Riot's terrible "I Can't Breathe" video after Eric Garner, but let's face it, it's not. Rhetorically, and more than rhetorically, Sviatov and his ilk really need Black oppression in order to make sense of, to make what they're saying legible. So we advertise this talk with this Instagram picture of Ksenia Sobchak. Ksenia Sobchak, of course, being the great it girl of the early 21st century, the host of Dom 2, the reality show, turned resistance leader and talk show host and sort of libertarian right-wing figure. This is from her Instagram, where she complains about looting and how this is disproportionate and it's just an eat the rich attitude. It's a really incredibly tone-deaf statement, which fits because she's started to become the face of a kind of right-wing Russian liberalism or libertarianism. She's not quite as bad as the journalist Yulia Lapinina, who actually explicitly defended apartheid a couple of years ago. But she's more disappointing because she's inconsistent enough to leave you hopeful now and then that she's actually going to say something smart. And look at this photo. It's classic, right? I mean, why is this the photo to go along with her statement about how racism is not so bad in Russia? It's basically her showing that she's cool with Black people. And it's absolutely ridiculous. It's not that far from the whole Dasha Zhukova scandal in 2014, when Dasha had a chair that was made to look like a Black woman. I think eventually the contest will be Dasha or Ksenia that will become the Russian equivalent of Karen. So the right-wing meme world is where we're going to get most of our stuff. The memes are easy to find. They fit in well with all sorts of online nationalist xenophobic discourse. And this world already portrays Black people as savage enemies. And if you wait patiently enough, you'll find that they're probably being manipulated by Jews, because of course they are. So where did I find all these images? Sadly, it was not hard to do using Google, but I also had a helpful suggestion from Elizabeth Elliot to look at the Vkontakte group Memы для русских, memes for Russians, which is reliably nationalistic with a mix of anime, Duma memes, and of course lots and lots of racism. So here's how I want to approach these memes. Rather than expose you to image after image, when possible, I'll show you one template so you know what it looks like, and simply describe the others that look like that template, and I'll let you rest your eyes, because I'm very uncomfortable just showing you racist caricature after racist caricature. We have to see it, but we don't have to see it all the time. So for one of the most productive, and by productive I mean replicable meme patterns on the Russian racist internet is this notion, is "Ты что, расист? Да. What, are you a racist? Yes, I am." The question part, "Are you a racist?" comes up again and again. It's we're going to see it a lot when the response of some Black person to something you perceived as racist, but that response in itself is usually troped as being dishonest or stupid, because it's not about racism, it's about some sort of inferiority of the Black people. And I think the caricature of this Black man speaks for itself. One more of those. These two particular Black images are all over the Russian racist internet. The guy with the Nike, certainly, and then this guy with the teeth. And so here's a white guy saying, "What are you doing? Why are you burning my car? What does my private property have to do with it? How does my burnt car help convict a cop?" And to which they say, "What, are you a racist?" So there's a lot of that. So let me tell you about a few more of them without showing them to you. There's one where Tim Cook is explaining to these guys that the iPhones that they've stolen from Apple stores have been bricked and won't work, to which they respond, "What, are you a racist?" There is a white guy wearing a mask who's trying to be an ally, who says, "Finally, Black people are rising up against the unfair racist US regime," and the Black guy says, "Ooga booga, give me your iPhone." The whole idea here is that the West is stupid for falling for accusations of racism and going along with it will always come back to hurt them. We see that here with a CNN person saying, good for you. You should continue robbing the stores and beating the people who are in your way. And then a brick is thrown at him. Or another with another white guy saying, I'm on your side. And then he's beaten bloody with a baseball bat. There's this crying black man who's saying, I can't believe that this all happened because of some racist stereotypes. I need to fuck up a couple of private stores and take this big TV home so I can show them that I'm right. Beyond that, there's one of a three-panel meme with a black soccer player kneeling and a shirtless black man saying, I'm on your side, but I need your help. And then he runs across the soccer pitch carrying a flat screen TV. So the focus again and again is on the looting. Connected to that, in a sort of general campaign to make the people involved in the protests seem unworthy, is focusing on the unworthiness of George Floyd himself, which is something you see in right-wing media here in the United States, but this is quite common in the Russian meme world. So there's a lot of play to the fact that George Floyd was buried in a golden coffin. So here you see the sarcophagus of an Egyptian pharaoh, and here you see the golden coffin of George Floyd, who was sentenced 5 times for drugs and burglary. He's meeting Jesus, saying, Jesus, let me into heaven. And then Jesus reads his rap sheet, to which he says, what, are you a racist? And then there's one which suggests maybe he might be worthy, and it's the people who are protesting who are not. I cut out part of this meme because I think we've all seen enough images of the man of the cop on George Floyd's neck. George Floyd is dead. His ghost rises up and says, the cop is already behind bars. Why are you destroying your country? And it says, his soul is definitely white. So no matter how they deal with George Floyd, the racism of it is quite astonishing. And the insistence on dealing only with violence against property and resisting cops. It gets worse. There are many memes. I'm going to show you 2 that have to do with apes. Oh, I haven't gotten, sorry. Straight up racism about looting. This is what owners of private businesses are seeing at this very moment. Here's how the powers that be in the U.S. are dealing with the looting, and have a little black boy saying, "Are you my daddy?" And they're all running away from him. Lots of ape memes. This is America right now. This is the whole world. And this is the protests in the U.S. References to Grand Theft Auto again and again. This Elmo's involved here. Elmo's often involved in things. And then lots of comparisons to Russia that are quite interesting here. If the Marauders came to Russia, and we have the John Travolta meme, what would they see? Why are you bothering to destroy everything? Everything here is already destroyed and already robbed. So, you know, at least America is in good enough shape for people to loot. Russians, who are you for, the blacks or the whites? And then Danila from Brother and Brother 2 were for the Redskins. It's their land. Then some of them point back at Russia in a different way. These are amateur looters, and then here are members of parliament. These are professional looters. And in a crappy apartment where your bathtub's in the kitchen. In America, they're savage people like in the Stone Age. They loot, they burn, they fight. But you wash up right now before they turn off the hot water. Okay, and then, of course, inevitably about American accusations that Russians are involved in everything, and there was the thing that I can't remember who Rice was saying about that the Russians are probably encouraging this, and now they have CNN saying that the riots are typical Russian disorder. Here we have, so this is a meme pattern. I'm actually not sure where it comes from. If anyone can tell me, that would be great, but it's all over the Russian right-wing internet with this sort of big wolf dog, muscular one, and this little one. Here it says, Civil War in Russia. two revolutions, disbanding the Constituent Assembly, signing the Brest-Litovsk Pact, and here's civil war in the U.S. A black man died. So again, treating it completely as unimportant. Here's one that is actually not explicitly racist for once. The rest of the world, are you okay? And America lying then. But what does all of this have to do with Russia? Why is Russia coming up here? Well, there are a couple of opportunistic ways where Russia does get involved. Many of you probably saw the story about the Pushkin restaurant in California that was defended by a bunch of very tough-looking Russian guys to make sure that it was not looted. This was quite a sensation on Memes for Russians and elsewhere. And the fact that it's Pushkin really works in an obviously interesting fashion here. Here are the guys defending the Pushkin Russia restaurant, saying no, and then the black people are saying, haha, Pushkin was black, which of course, since he was of African descent, that plays in here a lot. No, you cannot defend your property. Ha, we're standing here like a wall. Pushkin, Russia. And then this Pushkin's poem about to the slanderers of Russia, and yet here's the picture of Pushkin, the great Russian poet, the symbol, our everything, made to look like a racist Russian caricature. So the memes are playing both sides here, right? You know, Russia is innocent of racism, and in fact, look, we have their greatest poet is black. Russia is defending its restaurant named after its greatest black poet, but at the same time, finding ways to make fun of the blackness of Pushkin himself. And then, quite interestingly, you may have also heard of the case of a Yandex taxi driver in St. Petersburg who was fired for refusing to give a ride to an African student, Bryansk University student who caught this all on camera. He was fired, and this turned into a huge sensation. A lot of people defending the driver, outraged. How is it that a Russian can't decide who he's going to put in a taxi nowadays? What are we coming to? And the hashtag that comes up here is, I think, really telling of exactly how these notions are spreading. Who's going to win? Not Yandex, but Ya Kuckold, or the guys on Russian Twitter. Or here, Yandex, do you understand that you're a cuckold? And going on about, you know, why they're supporting, why they fired the guy. Now, the word they're using, kukold, is not a Russian word. There's raganosets if you want to use it for an actual cuckold. But what they're doing is they are appropriating from English the alt-right terminology of cuckold or cuck that is used to describe white men who are too weak and too feminized and are letting people of color and minorities walk all over them. So at this point, you see how the international right wing plays itself out on these memes in Russian, even though the exact path of how the word cuckold, I don't know the exact path of how the word cuckold got into Russian, but the fact that it's used, it becomes a hashtag and becomes legible to enough people suggests a great deal of commonality that I think are rather disturbing. So how to conclude about all this, what to say about it. I think one of the most amazing things, I mean, the actual racism in here, I think, is probably not surprising to a lot of us. What was a little bit, at least interesting to me, was how many of these meme lords were able to make the current protests against police violence and the police violence and the looting somehow to be about Russian-American relations, about American weakness in general, and about Russia. Somehow it all comes back to Russia in a way that is kind of self-reassuring that, you know, that it is all about us in some particular way. And also, I think, could in a really terrifying way become portable or fungible, right? That is, if the people who are aligning themselves with these meme lords, who are understanding Black Lives Matter in this particularly regressive, racist way, are getting their message through, then it's quite easy to merge these attitudes with the already existing racist attitudes towards the racial and ethnic minorities who exist in much larger numbers in the Russian Federation. So what we see is American media inadvertently supplying more images for the racist Russian memes, and the American right wing, the alt-right, supplying a language to help them express some of the most horrifying ideas. I'm going to stop here. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Eliot. I'm going to open up the chat.
I'm going to stop sharing when I can find my cursor.
Okay, and looks like we have a question from Christy. Christy, you can unmute yourself.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Great. Thank you so much, Professor Borenstein, for this short course. I was just wondering, you know, I submitted an article for an essay contest about by the Foreign Policy magazine about how we might like reset Russian-American relations once again. And sort of what they had a whole webpage about sort of history and culture and politics and all of these things. And I admit I started writing an essay that had to do with sort of historical empathy.
Oh.
I started writing an essay about sort of just the interesting, I guess like the interesting intersections and differences between 19th century American history and 19th century Russian history, serfdom, slavery, emancipation, reactionist sort of assassinations and everything. And I when I started writing it, I was already doubting that it would it would be picked or taken sort of seriously, because I get the feeling that you know, in the American context, in American academia and in American policy circles, I find still a lot of, I guess, unfortunate tendencies to America's own sort of brand of chauvinism, I guess. And I'm wondering to what extent this is unhelpful when we're trying to build bridges and sort of highlight commonalities that sort of Russians and Americans can build on. It's very hard for me to think of a way of fostering sort of empathy among the Russian public in terms of sort of issues of race or oppression if a lot of the messaging from, I suppose, the 1990s and the early 2000s was, Russia is sort of behind and it needs to transition and it needs to become more like the US, and the US is, it's sort of blank, it sort of, I guess what I'm trying to say is it sort of papers over a lot of America's own shortcomings. So to what extent does America have, American scholars and the American public have a duty, even as scholars of Russia in like a small niche sense, to highlight or acknowledge America's own very real shortcomings as a democracy?
Well, I think it's incumbent on all of us, and I think it's also not that difficult to do, and very consistent with the traditions of American liberalism, the same traditions that have for years led the right wing to talk about how liberals are somehow anti-American or blame America first, right? That if I'm assuming that most of the academia we're talking about here in America is liberal, and I'm going to assume that as a shorthand because let's face it, it is, then I think on the whole we're very comfortable talking about problems with America. The irony, of course, in Soviet times was that, we'd talk about problems with America and the official Soviet publications would also talk about problems with America, right? So it wasn't exactly bilateral that way. And there's the whole question of whataboutism, right? That any critique of the Soviet Union would turn into, well, look what you do to Black people, which is not an argument. The response should be yes, and it is terrible. What I worry about is that, in fact, there is common ground being established between the United States and Russia, and it's on the right wing. Because the message of really hardcore racism is simple and easy to understand and translates really, really well. much better than liberal or leftist messages, which tend to value complexity and specificity and all the things that I think a lot of us here really like to think about. But they don't travel as well. They're not as easy to grab onto. And so strangely enough, I think there is a real coming together going on. It's just not the coming together that I would like to see.
All right. We had a comment from Faith. Speaking of the international alt-right, I was struck by the presence of CNN in these images, which I think come from Trump memes. Also struck that one of the racist images resembled Pepe the Frog.
Yeah, Pepe has made it over there in their various Pepe-like things. There's a lot of cross-fertilization that goes on in across the meme worlds in general, including in the right-wing meme world. CNN, I mean, CNN has always been big. CNN is the international face, I think, of American news, so it does make sense. But you're right, that notion is amplified by Trump because CNN is the enemy of the people. So it works. But I think there's room on the Russian right wing to have little respect for CNN even before Trump.
Okay, and a comment from Jennifer. I want to echo Christy's point. I wonder why we're focused on racism in Russia and things like Russian Lives Matter and giving less attention to the genuine solidarity building people on the Russian left are trying to stir up. I'm thinking of Kirill Medvedev's post on Facebook about police violence against migrant workers in Russia.
No, I agree. I think just focusing on Russian racism is not on its own constructive. In part, the problem here for me in a lecture on memes is I don't have much to work with that's anti-racist. So I completely agree that we should pay attention to Russian attempts at fighting racism, but they're not that visible in the world of internet memes. They're not winning the meme war right now by any means.
Sorry, just sorting through questions. Emily wanted to ask a question about the use of pogromy to refer to protest events. I would love to hear an answer to that question as well. Emily, if you want to unmute yourself.
Hi, yeah, this is my jag. Anyway, I've seen the word pogroma being used as if it's a neutral term for, I'm not really sure what, it's a neutral equivalent for what in English, and this has become a non-neutral term too, but looting, but then also to protest events in general. And I've seen it in places like Facebook, Novaya Gazeta. I haven't made a thorough search, but my understanding is that this term is not neutral, and I've been looking it up and I get different answers. That sometimes it's given as a neutral term for violence, and often it's referred to, and then other times it's being presented as a term that's specifically related to what I think of, racist and American, but, ethnic cleansing, especially against, Jewish people in Russia. And I don't really understand what's going on there. You might not have an answer, but
well, I have a provision.
If anyone knows, you would know. Thank you.
Sure, I have a provisional answer, but I'm willing to admit I could be wrong. But here's what I think. Because I was surprised by that many, many years ago, but I keep coming back to it. And my feeling from the sort of corpus of texts of contemporary texts in which I see and hear the word pogrom in Russian, that it is much less marked than it is in English. In English, it's an imported word, right? In English, pogrom is about the pogroms against Jews. That's why we have the word in English.
Okay.
And in English, it has no roots, just doesn't mean anything but that. But in Russian, it is more capacious. And I think is generally used in precisely the context that you talk about. However, there is, the most famous and most horrible pogroms that people talk about they're referred to as the еврейские pogroms, like the Jewish pogroms, which always struck me as odd, like the Jews are doing. It should really be the еврейские, or whatever, describing the object of them. But that, if those were the only pogroms, you wouldn't need to call them Jewish pogroms.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's more capacious, but I'm happy to defer to a native speaker who might have a corrective on that.
And I see that in the chat, Katya, sorry, I can't scroll up. Somebody, Katya Karstunsky says that it can't, pogrom, and I misgendered it, sorry. Pogrom can be a neutral term. So anyway, this is helpful. It's for me to
Sure.
look out what's going on. Thank you.
Sure.
And we had a response for a follow-up from Christy. Suppose I'll just follow up by saying I think it's exactly many American liberals, and especially American liberals who are also political scholars of Russia, who have not embraced fully the challenging complexities of liberalism and have for a couple of decades now avoided the complexities of American liberal democracy when they hold it up on a pedestal as sort of the gold standard by which to judge Russia.
I mean, I think that's a fair complaint, and I've seen it. It's not something that I feel in my particular circle. I see it among pundits, particularly, and I see it among people who might be less likely to describe as liberal. But also, even if that is true, it seems I'd be curious to see how much it's happening now, because it seems even less tenable of a vantage point. A point of departure under Trump than it would have several years ago. I mean, really, if we're not aware of the glass house we're in now, I don't know when we're going to be aware of it.
Okay, question from Lisa. What are public and private efforts to address and combat racism in Russia? Sorry, from Elizabeth.
Sure. So there are, I don't want, so when I've talked about social media, the majority of what I see is stuff that I would call racist, but there are people who do push back. There are people on the left in Russia who are very committed to anti-racist policies, which express themselves, I think, more in terms of defending the migrant workers, the people who are actually in direct peril from racism in Russia.
Mm-hmm.
The problem is, I think, the problem that you have with any kind of grassroots organizing in Russia today, which is that it's hard to do. It's, even before COVID, it's hard to have a protest. There are organizations, but the problem, I think, there are problems of getting access to large-scale media, getting access to publicity, getting sympathetic attention. But it's a huge country, and particularly in the big cities, there are plenty of people who are very concerned about making Russia a more positively anti-racist society. But again, and maybe I'm going to sound like one of those American liberals who thinks everything's wonderful here. I don't see so much room right at this particular moment in the Russian Federation to be really optimistic about grassroots social change. I've been optimistic before because I'm an American, and I thought I'd conquered my optimism years ago, and I was mistaken. So we'll see.
Thank you.
And we had a response from Maria also to that question. Lisa, as a Russian, I have had many difficult conversations with my friends or used to be friends to give them another perspective on the issue. Some of my friends who actually listen to and read Black leaders practice the same. There are a few organizations who also try to educate publicly on xenophobia. For example, Нужна помощь and Refugee Help, and Комитет гражданское содействие. And the links to those organizations are in the chat. Okay. Now, question from Lev. Do you think some of the Russian reaction, in addition to racism, has to do with international conceptions of American exceptionalism, opposing BLM because they don't think of America as deeply flawed, in addition to deep racism?
An interesting question. I think they do think of America as deeply flawed, but the flaws, this goes back to the question, the issue I was talking about with the kind of imperial or majority projection. I would say that among the sort of people who are spreading the memes, the flaws in America are too much tolerance, too much interest in multiculturalism, and not accepting, the white man's burden, frankly, not accepting the idea that American whites should see themselves as the majority and therefore rule that way. So it's not. I wouldn't see it as a admission of American exceptionalism. I see it as a diagnosis of a country that should, in quotes, be acting like a racially based empire and is hesitant to do it.
Okay. Question from Elena. Are there attempts by Russian liberals to tie into the rhetoric of police violence and draw parallels between the US and Russia?
Of course, but I think recently all the oxygen in that particular room has been taken up by the Russian Lives Matter hashtag that Skeptic came up with. That doesn't have to last at all. And as I mentioned, in fact, Pussy Riot with their Eric Garner video a few years ago was trying to do the same thing. I think they did it really badly, but they were making a sincere attempt. But I don't know, if I were a Russian liberal right now concerned with police violence, I'd probably just be mostly concerned with police violence in my country, because it would be what's affecting me directly, and be sympathetic and supportive of the cause in the United States, but really be paying attention to what's happening around me.
Okay, and we have a hand up from Joshua Simpson. Joshua, I can unmute you.
Okay, there we go. So my question is related to the demographics of this trend, I guess you could say, in Russian meme culture. Do you have collected data about which kinds of Russians, mostly age and gender, are supporting these kind of ideas, and then also how that plays into the Russian demographics and politics in a broader sense? No,
I don't. I sometimes see names or nicknames really by these memes. There's a lot that suggests that most of them are made by men, but that could be my my prejudice. But I have no empirical data that can give you any demographic.
Okay.
analysis.
Well, thank you anyway.
Sure.
Okay. Right, and we have okay, question from Olga. These memes are very much together with the proportion of the official Russian news about protests and about looting. What is the role of official news in supporting this position?
In supporting the position of focusing on looting? If that's what they're saying, then I think that's very much what you see on state television. Certainly Solovyov in his broadcasts focuses quite heavily on looting. And there, actually, just today, the Russian Reader translated a really good article which gives quotes from 3 different public intellectual and media figures talking about Black Lives Matter and saying rather racist things, and one of them is Solovyov. This is not surprising, because this fits into the narrative about America that state television has been giving for quite a while. We're falling apart, we're weak, we're effete, and we're stupidly multicultural, and it's gonna destroy us.
Okay, and question from Yelena. I'm wondering how a notion of white privilege circulates in the post-Soviet context, especially how it transforms into a somewhat class privilege notion among the Russian rich in their defense of expensive brands, a material and performative attribute of the Russian elite from looting.
That's fascinating. The brand, so I have not encountered the equivalent, an equivalent to the discussion of white privilege that we have in English in America in Russia, but I haven't looked, and I might not be looking in the right places. To my limited knowledge, that has not been a part of a big part of the discussion. If I'm wrong, please someone tell me. I'd love to hear about it. But again, in part because even as there are phenomena that we would call racism in Russia, with no doubt, the discussion, the terminology of race, the discussion of it, it's not exactly the same as it is in the United States, nor should it be, right? It's, I think from a US point of view, it's messier as it maps onto nationality and ethnicity. So it's whiteness as such is not the thing I see talked about much except on the extreme right. Because whiteness was not constructed as the main issue or category. It's Europeanness, it's being Slavic. One could say these are stand-ins, but I think to say they're stand-ins would be to say that American notions of race are the true ones, and everything else is deviating from it. I'm not trying to defend Russia from charges of racism by any means, but I think that just the structure and the categories don't map on extremely well. So if there's something like white privilege being discussed, I'd love to hear about that, but I haven't seen it.
Okay, and question from Zena. How much of the current understanding of race in Russia do you think has to do with or stems from images of Africa in Russian cartoons and children's books?
Well, those don't help. The ones I've seen would not help. But I think, it's funny, there's a discussion right now about, the way in which American television and entertainment always makes cops the good guys. And so recently they brought up Paw Patrol, the cartoon Paw Patrol, which I've actually never seen. It's like one of the few cartoons I haven't suffered through. But Paw Patrol is basically animal cops. And there's a discussion back and forth, like, does it really matter? And the answer a lot of people give is, well, it fits in, but it's really not the main culprit. If I were designing the cultural inputs that small children would get, I would not have those images of Africans in Africa in the children's books by any means. But if that were the only thing, I think it wouldn't matter as much. I think there are larger contexts in the culture that then support an ongoing othering of Black people and African people that go further than just the images in the children's books. But the images to the eyes of outsiders, the images of Africans in the children's books are quite shocking.
Okay, and a question from Maxime. Something that seems to be quite common among Soviet/post-Soviet intelligentsia is a wholesale rejection of Soviet internationalism and Druzhba Narodov, which are often equated with hated and despised Soviet propaganda. I think these sentiments continue to inform political behaviors and choices, often right-wing, on the part of many Soviet immigrants in the West. Great talk, Eliot. Thank you.
I couldn't agree with you more about Soviet propaganda and Soviet internationalism. I think they all ended up being discredited along with so much else with the Soviet Union, even if that might be something that some of us would choose to keep in a different form. And I think one of the problems with it was the problem that I was talking about with all sorts of social issues, which is that it was not part of an ongoing, evolving discussion. It was simply a set of platitudes that you had to parrot back. And so that in fact, talk of Druzhba Narodov, of internationalism, sounds like bullshit or hypocrisy. And then I think this feeds in very well, not just into rejection of internationalism, but also rejection of, say, Western sensitivities about racism and all that as just being hypocrisy, kind of like the discussion of Druzhba Narodov internationalism. But I agree with you completely.
In a comment from Alexandra, there are meaningful conversations about race and ethnicity-related privilege happening among the Russian left, which, as Eliot said, might be less visible compared to racist memes. Such conversations take place on Facebook and small independent online media and usually go hand in hand with feminist and queer activism.
Absolutely, and it's wonderful that it is happening, and I think yeah, it's happening in their own small communities. If people in the feminist and queer activist world want to start making anti-racist memes, that would be fantastic. I would hope they would take off. But I imagine you have other priorities too.
Okay, and a question from Katya. What do you think of the tendency of a lot of Russian public to side with the strong, rich, and powerful versus weak, poor, and powerless? Does it have to do with not being able to change anything in real life?
it's so funny because it seems like it's the opposite of every lesson that great Russian literature has been teaching us for 200 years, like the little man running after the carriage, feeling sorry for the weak, and so on and so forth. And now you have this kind of weird Ayn Randian libertarian worship of the rich and the powerful. It's, you know, it is absolutely astonishing to me. And I assume it has to do with all of the changes that have happened, obviously. But in a way that I can't particularly express very well right now off the top of my head, I think it fits in with really the phenomena that I think really describes what Russia is after 1991. Not if it's Yeltsin's Russia, Putinist Russia, or post-Soviet, that it's neoliberal Russia. And with its emphasis on individual achievement and a de-emphasis on any kind of collective ties and collective responsibilities. So in that you're getting something a little closer to this long-standing American worship of the rich guy who is successful. But it seems like something, as with almost everything, it's something I never would have predicted. But as I've said before, I'm terrible at predicting, and so this has come as a surprise to me.
We have a question from Holly. Is posting these Russian memes part of a programmed campaign on the part of Russia to support the right in the US, or are they posted by average Russian citizens?
I have no evidence either way. I tend to be skeptical of explanations that assume that there's some hand behind things, even though sometimes there is, as we know, because it's quite conceivable to me that there are independent actors all over Russia who find an appeal in this and who make these memes. So it's also possible that there's some support or funding from somewhere, but that doesn't mean that the individual initiative of these racists does not exist. So I don't know, but I think I have faith in the can-do initiative of racists around the world to do this on their own.
Okay, and a question from Tanya. Thank you, Eliot. Have you encountered many references to Brother 2 in the memes? I'm wondering because of the recent screening of Brother 2, followed by the news block capturing the looted, synced with Butусov's Goodbye America.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was thinking of that too. Besides the one I showed you, not really, which kind of surprises me because it fits so well. But no, I think I think this is a way that Brother 2 really opened up a space for people like these meme makers, a cultural space to be much more explicitly chauvinist and racist. So yeah, I think they're missing an opportunity. So if you want to give them some advice and send them some screenshots, there's probably plenty of things they could do with Brother 2 to make memes.
All right. Do we have any more questions for anyone? Oh, just got one. Does indigenous racism against Central Asians and Caucasians in particular show up in memes a lot, or is it something that people don't like to talk about online?
You know, I've seen it, definitely. So here's the thing. I've seen it. If I had started this project a while ago, someone suggested that I do something on I think Peter actually suggested I do something on racism memes, and I was reluctant because I didn't want to just sort of show one racist meme after another. But if I had started doing the research before Black Lives Matter, given the little bit I remember seeing, you would see a lot more Caucasian, with an asterisk there, and Central Asian memes because of the hostility towards people of those backgrounds. But at the moment, it's being eclipsed by anti-Black memes. But they're out there. They're out there, definitely.
A question from Eisener. Thank you very much, Eliot. When you mentioned the Russian Lives Matter hashtag, I wondered if there was a Russian reactionary or not Me Too hashtag campaign on Twitter.
Well, an equivalent was the «Я не боюсь сказать» hashtag campaign, I'm not afraid to tell, usually translated as I'm not afraid to say, but I think it should be I'm not afraid to tell, where women would write about their experience with as victims of rape and sexual violence, both in Russia and Ukraine. That that got a great deal of attention. In the media, in the Russian, in the media, when Me Too started coming out, I saw a lot of very negative reactions to the Me Too movement in Russia. And I suspect, again, if I were hunting for memes at that time, I probably would have found stuff. But I'm not really aware of it. But the "Я не боюсь сказать" is a great moment of feminist activism on Twitter that was really inspiring.
All right, any more questions? Yes. I heard the anthropologist Sasha Arkhipova make a distinction between luterstva and maroderstva. Luterstva, she claimed, was a typically American form of protest. Is this distinction reflected in memes at all?
I haven't seen the distinction in memes. What I have seen when I looked it up was that as luterstva has been proposed, which is sort of yet another ugly English word being brought into the Russian language, it's trying to make a distinction between Мародерство, I think, comes from the English word marauding, but we don't really use it very much. A distinction between pillaging, which is done at times of war, and looting, which is done in peacetime, which is frankly not a distinction I was consciously aware of, though I think it kind of makes some sense. The need to come up with the term luterstvo is puzzling to me, and the only possible benefit I could see from it would be as if it were being used, frankly, by progressives to try to decouple it from associations that people who speak Russian have with maraviorstvo. But I haven't seen any of that decoupling going on in memes.
And a question from Elizabeth, what has happened to Patrice Lumumba University in Moscow?
What has? I think Maxime might be able to answer this, right? Are you still there? I remember it was in the news at some point recently, but I don't remember what's happened with it. Is Maxime Matusevich still there?
I don't think so.
Does anyone have an update on the status of that university right now? I think it still exists in some form, but I don't really know what's going on with it.
Okay. And any other questions?
Since we have Jennifer Wilson here, Jen, did you want to say anything? Did you want to say anything in regard to the alt-right question that was asked earlier? Not to cold call someone whose video is off, but since we happen to have you here, I was giving a shout out to the event you're doing. You're still muted.
No worries. What was the question again?
Oh, sorry. I just wanted to say there had been a question about alt-right and the expansion of the alt-right and links between the alt-right and in the US and alt-right in Russia and the way to which these kind of racist memes play into this. So I didn't know if you wanted to say anything in regard to, I had given a shout out in the chat to the event that you ran at the Jordan Center a few years ago and the video from it. But if not, feel absolutely free to say no.
No, I mean, thank you. I think that one of the points that we tried to make at that event, and I tried to make in my writing, was that said a lot more about racism in the United States and how racists here really project certain kind of fantasies about whiteness.
I think we just
on.
No, maybe I did.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry. That how kind of the alt-right community in the United States was projecting kind of racial fantasies onto Russia, and kind of Richard Spencer was sort of wearing this cologne that he thought was worn by the Romanovs and things like that. And so I think it was very much more about kind of racism in U.S. politics and how kind of Russia was sort of fitting into a really false image of Russia as this kind of completely white country was sort of operating in their imagination. And I think that actually Sarah Lewis, who's an art history professor at Harvard, is doing something on this phenomenon in the 19th century. and how like the racists during the Civil War, slave owners, were very concerned about the war in the Caucasus, and would sort of talk about how the white race was under attack because of the fighting in the Caucasus. And so she actually has a whole book coming out, I think later this year. It's called The Caucasian War, but it's exclusively about kind of how the Caucasus functioned in the kind of racial imaginary of the United States in the 19th century.
That's amazing. I didn't know that the Caucasus functioned in the American racial imaginary in the 19th century. That's amazing. It's coming out this year?
I think so.
Great.
I don't want to rush her, but
I do.
I've been waiting with but there's actually, I'll post it. She wrote an article for the New Yorker.
He actually gave a talk at the Jordan Center also. So Katie David just gave a link to that talk in the chat function.
She was also the keynote speaker for the conference I organized at University of Pennsylvania on race in Eurasia.
Quick question, if I may. Would you comment on this phenomenon of young people, assume mostly young people, engaging with, enjoying, let's call it Black culture, perhaps in the form of rap or whatever form they take, it takes, it attracts them. And at the same time, of course, harboring various racist sentiments. And I think there's definitely, and you might have mentioned this, an analogous phenomenon here in the States where young white people will dress the way they see their Black classmates dressing, and of course are really into the music and other things too. Is there any hopeful side of the that side that admires or likes culture which is associated with Blacks in our minds and their minds? I mean, in Russians and Americans.
Well, if history is any indication, there's an amazing capacity of large groups of white people to appropriate Black culture and yet still hate Black people.
Yeah.
It's, there's precedent. In Russia, I remember I was fascinated when rap started to take off because at the time in America, this was before Eminem, and so it was very strange to see all of these white guys in Russia doing rap. It was like this sort of Vanilla Ice thing, but it was never marked as strange in Russia, I think, in the absence of a thriving local Black culture. And so the appropriation of hip hop there, I think, is probably seen as similar to the appropriation of rock and roll and any other particular trend, and doesn't have to build any kind of empathy necessarily.
Yeah, that's a shame. Quick remark on Brat Dva. There is a scene there where Badrov, young Badrov, is making out with a Black woman.
Yeah.
I'm not sure how to process that in the context of the discussion here.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm trying to remember how that ends up playing it out. I mean, I think my stronger impressions are about the conversation he has with the Russian sex worker about white people being weak and Black people having a savage strength. Yeah.
Okay, well, this has been great. Thank you.
Any last comments or questions? All right, well, our attempt at having a short course keeps getting longer and longer, as I said, both in terms of the number of lectures and the number and the length that this goes. So we really appreciate all of you sticking around for this time, but especially a huge, huge thanks to Eliot for the presentation again and for sticking around. Thanks, it was great to see so many of you here. Huge thanks to Sasha for organizing all of this. And Eliot, is Elon Musk been pushed to next week, or are we not sure?
I'm optimistic that nothing will happen between now and next Friday that will make me bump Elon Musk. But I make no promises, but magic.
And it's quite possible that Elon Musk, knowing that he was bumped for a week, will happen between now and next Friday and cause a big issue. But anyway, all right, so we'll all look forward to Elon Musk in the internet memes continuing throughout lecture series. Thank you so much for seeing all of you here. Have a great weekend. Thank you, Sasha. Thank you, Eliot. And thanks to all of you for joining us here at the Jordan Center. Take care. Have a great weekend.